Well, hello there. It's David Baer here from winebear.net, and it's another wine conversation. Today, I'm really excited to have with me as my guest John Paul, the founder and creator of Cameron Winery in Oregon. Now, this is a winery that I was first introduced to after moving across the country to Oregon. It's what I might call a hidden gem, a secret. However, it's a really, really well-known and highly respected winery right here in the state, but most people throughout North America don't know about it. And I think we're going to get into why as we proceed with our conversation with John Paul. So, hey, John, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to be having a chance to chat with you, and let's get into Cameron Winery. So, can you just give us all a brief introduction?
Yeah, and actually, not only am I not well known outside the state, if you travel like down the valley to Eugene, I've done tastings down there. Keep in mind, I've been at this for 30 years in Oregon now. People will come up to me and they go, "So, are you a new winery?" That's 100 miles down the road. So yeah, that shows you how kind of under the radar I fly. Basically, by various means that I'm sure we'll get into, I started this winery about 30 years ago, and I'm kind of shocked to look in the mirror now and find out that I'm one of the old guys in the industry, and which is a bit of a sobering thought. And when I go to tastings now, I am kind of treated like kind of an elder there, which is, also a bit sobering. But I've been at it for a while, and I think one of the things about wine that kind of keeps you young is if you are continually discovering new things and you're open to that, it just keeps you always kind of alert and going. And so I've always taken on the tack that I'm just into learning new things, finding new things, trying new grape varieties, trying new methodology, rather than just being kind of a production guy where I just make the same wine year after year. I'm dissatisfied with doing that. I'm an experimenter. I'm a scientist by training, and so if you walked out into my vineyard, you would find that it is a labyrinth of experiments in progress. So that's kind of an introduction about what I'm about, what my winery is about.
Well, that's great. That's great. So for those of the audience who don't know Cameron, let's just give them a quick introduction to the types of things that you have been working on over the past 30 years. What you're known for in terms of both the wines you produce and maybe a little bit about the philosophy behind what you're producing as well, or how you're producing.
All right. Well, I came up here from California. That's where I started my winemaking in pursuit of Burgundy. And while I was in California in the Napa Valley, I met a bunch of guys at the time who were kind of the young, upcoming, just being put in charge of their wineries in Burgundy. And they had been sent there by their fathers because that was the kind of the new wave of things going on in wine, and they wanted them to learn what Californians were doing. And so it was also a great crucible for me to be in. I learned a lot of cutting-edge stuff, but then I met these guys. And by meeting these guys, I had access to going to Burgundy, seeing what they were all about. And one of the things that happened going over there, and I'm talking about, people that are well-known in Burgundy now, and I can give you a bunch of names. That's not important. The main thing was that I got access into the cellars, seeing what they were doing, trying their wines, seeing what they were about, and being totally inspired by the wines that they were making. The downside was when I came back after several of these trips to California, I started realizing that that was not the place that I could make these kind of wines.
And this was, what time period was this?
This was early 80s. So okay. This was like 78, 9, 80, 81, 82. And so it was just, it was a great experience, and yet at the same time I realized what I really wanted to make was not California Pinot Noir. I wanted to make Burgundy, and I've always been free about that. Even in Oregon, I'll get around a lot of winemakers, somebody going, well, we're not trying to make Burgundy, we're trying to make Oregon, and I'll usually raise my hand and go, actually, I'm trying to make Burgundy. And I mean it. I think that that's the standard upon which great Pinot Noir and Chardonnay needs to be met. And so if you're not paying attention to what they're doing and kind of trying to emulate their approach, then you're going to miss out what these grapes have to offer you. And so I took that with me to Oregon because I realized one of the things that brought me to Oregon was that if you looked at the countryside around Burgundy and the kind of things that grow there, you realize that it didn't look like Northern California. It looked like Oregon. It was kind of the same kind of plants, and it just reminded me of Oregon in a lot of ways, being around Burgundy. So that was kind of one of the things. And then you start looking more specifically at just climatic things. You start realizing, you know, average temperatures, rainfall during the year, and that sort of thing. It starts adding up. And then you add on top of that people that were already here, like David Lett at Eyrie, who were already establishing that Pinot Noir from Oregon was actually a really serious thing. And I have to add, when I came here, I always knew, even though people weren't talking about it at the time, I knew that Chardonnay should be just as fantastic here as Pinot Noir. And it's kind of been a bit of a lonely crusade on Chardonnay, but that's starting to take off now too, which is kind of fun.
And in fact, we'll get to this in a little bit, but some of the folks who have worked with you are actually really well known for the Chardonnays that they're producing as well. So.
I hope so. That's
Well, that's great. So, so you have been focusing on the two main varieties of Burgundy, and the other folks who came before you also came up from California, in fact, into Oregon to explore for various reasons, making wine up here and settled on the Burgundy varieties as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And I always like to joke with when somebody from California comes up, has been here for a while, and announces that they're from California, I usually laugh and go, "Hey, we're all from California."
Hey, some of us are from New York, but I'll take exception.
New York. My wife is actually one of the few native Oregonians that I know.
Yeah. Now, I don't know when the other things that you're known for entered into your portfolio, your lineup, but you didn't stop at Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and perhaps you can talk a little bit more about that in some detail later. But what else is it that you're doing now?
Well, you know, and interesting, and I'll just, as a way to, you know, let people understand how it is you get sidetracked on these other things. When I started to make my wine here and sell it, I realized that the way I wanted to go about my marketing plan was to sell it myself wholesale in Portland rather than go through a distributor. Mm-hmm. And apologies to you because I know you've worked with distributors for a while, but what I saw was that by being my own distributor, I could take the markup that distributors get on the wine. If I sold most of my wine locally, I could actually make a good living with a small production. So I kind of took that and ran with it, and it turns out that the very first account that I sold wine to, I'm looping you back to your original question here, mm-hmm. Was Postowitz, okay. And they were mostly specialists in Italian varietals and some Spanish, but largely Italian, and they were selling Oregon wines as well. And I got to be friends with the people at Postowitz, Don Oman and Peter DeGarmo, and they started turning me on to all these incredible wines from northern Italy, at which point I suddenly realized, wait a minute, northern Italy is the same latitude as we are here in Oregon. The 45th parallel runs just south of Burgundy and runs right through the middle of Piedmont and through Friuli and all those areas. So I started thinking, well, maybe I can do some of these things too. So there began a long love affair with Italy, and so I started kind of, and I still have. I just recently got back from a trip to northern Italy, and starting to experiment with things from that area as well.
So you also did, you helped explain a little bit about my introduction to you, why you're not really as well known outside of the Portland area, and I think it speaks to some decisions you made about your business and about the being able to produce at lower levels, which is something that I think a lot of producers would love to be able to get their hands on every single grape and you know, really be in every single bottle, themselves in some way. And I think that you've been able to find a way financially to structure that in your business, which is, I think, speaks really, really well to the fact that it's possible for people to do, and you've
Well,
been doing it for decades now.
and let me tell you what the inspiration for this was. All those trips I told you about earlier to Burgundy, one of the things that I paid attention to was the really cool cellars that I went to. I always asked them, one of my questions always was, how many bottles do you make? And all these guys, their answer was always like 40 to 50,000 bottles.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys had in common that when I went to visit them, usually I had to pull them out of the vineyard. They were working out in the vineyard to get them into the cellar, and we'd taste wine in the cellar. And I realized that's what I want to do. I don't want to manage a business. I want to prune grapes and make decisions in the vineyard and make the wine, and that's what I want my focus to be, which means I want to be 40 to 50,000 bottles, which is about 3 to 4,000 cases. So then the question was, how can I do that?
Can you put that in some context for our viewers in terms of what they might, if they're in a grocery store, they're in a wine shop, they see wines all over the place that are from mid-sized to large producers. What is 40,000 bottles compared to what those guys are producing?
This is a small winery. This is a very small winery, and I mean, for example, distributing outside of Oregon. My biggest market is New York City, and the wine that I shipped them in the fall was literally 50 cases. And that was 5 different wines.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of quantities I'm talking about shipping out of state. It's very, very small. They end up going mostly to restaurants. They'll go to some retail shops, but it's not something you're going to see in Whole Foods, for example. There's just not enough production to do that. So it's a very, very small enterprise. And those guys from Burgundy, it's kind of the same thing. You don't see their wines in every wine shop as well. They're in specific markets, and they're in small quantities. And when the wines come into those markets, people fight to get them.
Yeah.
And of course, that's what I want to do with my wine.
Well, I did find your wine in a New York City restaurant at one point, and I was very, very happy to be able to order it. So there you go. You accomplished that.
Thank you.
So, all right. So you talked a bit about liking to be out in the vineyard and doing stuff with your hands and really getting into it. And you have some very strong philosophical things that drive what it is that you're doing. In going through a little bit of research, I came across at least 3 or 4 places discussions about two terms. One, I already mentioned earlier, dry farming or irrigation. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But also cellar funk, and I want you to talk a little bit about what people are referring to when they talk about the Cameron cellar funk.
Yeah, this is one of those things that I think you learn to either love or hate Cameron wines based on the funk. And I never get involved in these blogs, but there are these geeky wine blogs where guys get on, and I have somebody that will go, oh, this wine from Cameron, it's a little reduced. And you'll get some guy going, but that's great. That's what these wines are about. And so I just kind of let it go. But once I get into the cellar, my approach is based a bit on these old traditional ways of making wine in Burgundy, and it's kind of to back away and let the wines be. And one of the examples I can give is oftentimes right towards the end of fermentation, maybe as you're going into barrel or slightly after you go into barrel, these wines will have a smell of rotten eggs, which is not really what anybody wants out there. I think we can all agree smelling rotten eggs is not something we aspire to. And a lot of winemakers will immediately panic when they smell that, and they'll add what's called blue fining, which is copper to the wine, which will grab it and pull it out of the wine and try to clean the wines up. All those kind of things, however, are not specific, so they will not only pull out that rotten egg smell, but they will pull other things out of the wine that you don't really want to pull out. So my approach is to leave it alone, let it see if it resolves itself. A lot of times that rotten egg will turn into smoky or tobacco or some kind of meaty type of aromatic, which is attractive to the wine. But the wines in general have this overwhelming sense of kind of being let to happen on their own. And some people like that and some people don't. My philosophy's been that since I'm a very small winery, I don't need to appeal to everybody out there. I just need enough people who share my love of the type of wines, and I'm okay. It's a bit like wines from some of these areas like Jura and other areas that, for example, my wife and I have these discussions, and she doesn't like a lot of these. In fact, she doesn't like a lot of, I will admit, my wife does not like a lot of, in fact, most of the Pinot Noir that I make. That being said, she does love the Chardonnay that I make, so I'm okay. She's more of a white wine drinker anyway. So
there you go. Great.
Yeah.
Well, you heard it here. You heard it here first, folks. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you've been telling people this for many years. Who knows? But no, that's great, and I think it speaks to what a lot of entrepreneurs deal with in terms of their concern about weighing mass appeal and being able to speak to everybody, or finding that that smaller audience that really resonates with what it is that they're doing, and clearly that's been part of what's driven your business very effectively. So
yeah, when I run up against people that really like the wines that I make, it's great. It's like they are disciples. They're out there telling everybody how great these wines are, and of course they are sometimes shocked when they open a bottle and not everybody agrees with them. That's just kind of, and there was, in fact, I'll give you a good example. This is actually a really funny story that happened one night. I was in a local restaurant, and I had some people from my distributor up in Seattle that I sell to down there. We were having dinner, and at the table next to us, they ordered a bottle of the Clos Electrique Rouge, which is the red Pinot Noir that I make. It's my estate vintage, Clos Electrique. And the particular vintage they were ordering, I knew was this wine that we decided to put in the bottle and not do anything about cleaning it up. I mean, I have to admit, occasionally I do clean these wines up a bit over the edge. This wine was right on the edge, and it was something that the guys coming down and trying wine in the cellar always really liked. But women coming down were kind of like, they didn't care for it. It was just a bit over the top for them. But we decided, since it was like 125 cases that I was making, that we would go ahead and bottle it, and we referred to it as the marital discord wine amongst ourselves. Well, they order this bottle of wine, it's this couple, and the waiter comes out, he pulls the cork, and of course, normally they pour it for the guy, which he did, and the guy smells it, he's going, oh yes, this is amazing. The guy pours it for her, pours it for him. She's swirling it, smelling it, and the guy walks away out of earshot. He goes, are you crazy? This is awful. And he's going, no, it's really good. And this whole argument ensued between them, and and I'm over there just kind of laughing quietly because.
Wow.
Yeah. So I try not to make the wines quite that controversial anymore because I don't want to get guys in trouble. But occasionally it happens.
It's great to have been a fly on the wall in that situation, certainly. But that's great. That's great. So you have we'll get to dry farming as well in a moment. But you've thanks for explaining the cellar funk concept that people have shared out there. But I came across a quote from you. The attraction of wine is its inconsistency, and I think you've already referred a little bit to that philosophy. But can you sort of give us a little better understanding of what you mean behind that?
Yeah, consistency is it's one of those things that a lot of people hide behind. But I mean, I always like to say that, well, Coca-Cola is very consistent. It's the same from one bottle to the next whenever you get it. One of the beauties of wine is that inconsistency, that variation between from one year to another where the weather changes. The variation of who knows what that went on in the cellar that year. For example, this year we had a very cold November, and the cellar cooled down, and all of my whites stalled in the middle of fermentation, and so I'm busy trying to get that going. But that's going to have an impact on the way those wines come out eventually, for good or for bad.
So just for those who don't understand what a stalled fermentation is, can you just break that down for us for a moment?
The yeast are in there, and they're eating up the sugar, and they're making alcohol, and they're producing aromatic compounds, and it's just a microbiological. It's a growth, like when you're making bread and you need to warm up that the yeast that are in the dough, and the dough rises. Mm-hmm. Same thing with wine. If it gets too cold, the yeast can't grow very well, and they kind of slow down and they halt. So here you are with this wine fermenting away with a bunch of sugar, and all of a sudden fermentation stops, and there's still sugar in it, and the yeast are going, nope, too cold for me, I'm not going to do this. So that's called a stalled fermentation, and it's a bit distressing, I have to say.
And there are ways to deal with that, but perhaps you decide not to enter into some of those interventions, I guess.
Well, I see my approach, and this is a good insight into the way I do things, is particularly for the barrels of Chardonnay, is to wait. The cellar will warm up in a couple of months. It will start to warm up, and as it warms up and the wine warms up, the yeast will most likely take off. Now, if they don't, then at some point I have to intervene and maybe make up some new yeast cultures and do that sort of thing. But yeah, my approach is to just, this isn't the first time in history that wine's gotten too cold in the barrel and is stalled, and so let's just wait and see, see what happens.
Okay.
Right. So consistency is a thing where people try to do the same thing every year, treat the fruit exactly the same, and every year is a really different vintage. And so in pursuit of consistency, you have people that buy things that, say, in a wet year, pull the water out of the wine in order to concentrate what's there. And I look at it differently. I say, well, this was a wet vintage, and the way this wine comes out should be a reflection of what that vintage was. I don't want 2013 to look like 2012. I want it to look like 2013. So that people who get into different vintages can say, oh, 2013, yeah, this wine had to be picked early, didn't it? And so it's a little bit less ripe than 2012, but I remember that vintage. I remember the way the weather was then. And I think particularly when you sell wine largely locally in Portland like I do, people kind of remember, they relate to those vintages. If you're in New York City, obviously you don't know what the weather was like in Portland or in Oregon in 2012 versus 13, but they do know that here. And so it plays into my local distribution.
Yeah, that's actually a brilliant insight into how you can play off of all of that. People do they live through it, right? So they can think back to that. And I remember the last several years we had some very cold summers, and I'm seeing that reflected in several of the wines. And then suddenly we had a nice warmer summer, and you see that reflected in that year. So absolutely, that's great.
And then they're inconsistent, and it makes it kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, so how does this issue of consistency or inconsistency relate to one of the things that you are best known for in terms of philosophy, and even a group that I'll let you talk about that you founded, relating to dry farming, to the lack of irrigation, and perhaps you can just give us the context for what irrigation is about, why it's used in agriculture, and why you don't necessarily like it in the context of the work that you're doing.
Well, I think the first thing that people need to realize is that grapes have been selected for eons partly because they have roots that go very, very deeply down in the soil, and they can live almost anywhere. I've seen grapevines on Socorro Island in the Aegean off of Greece that are literally on pumice, and they get less than 10 inches of rain a year, which by most people's definition is a desert, and they're just growing there. And it's a job to grow them, but they make pretty amazing wines in that situation. So my point merely being that grapes can grow virtually anywhere without irrigation. But what happened was in the 1970s, I'm going to say late 70s, but maybe mid 70s, in California, they really started introducing the concept of irrigation in grapevines. And it, I think, was more of a invention of people who were beholden to banks and accountants more than it was to people who were looking at, you know, the quality of the product that they were doing. Because when you put irrigation in, drip irrigation, on the grapes, you can get your vines into production very, very quickly. So if you've taken out a big loan and you need to start paying it back, you want to get those grapes in production as fast as you can with as big a crop as you can, and irrigation aids in that. My point is, let's slow down and I'm sorry if you have a big debt that you have to pay off, but let's think of what the long-term consequences of this practice are. And I should also say that in Europe, all the great wine producing regions are all dry farmed, that is, no irrigation. Irrigation is not allowed. In France, if you irrigate, and they do to some extent in the Midi in southern France, you can only put vin de péage. You can't put a place of origin on the grape, because they realize that as soon as you irrigate, you've taken away one of the most basic parts of terroir, which you may, hopefully people understand that a little bit, but terroir is basically everything that goes into that grapevine, and precipitation is a big part of it. So as soon as you irrigate, you've taken that important component away. So I got into this concept of let's really keep terroir in the wines and not compromise it in any way. And I saw this as I was in California, more and more vineyards being irrigated. And one of the downsides of the irrigation that I noticed is that the alcohols started going up in the wines, because when you irrigate, you get a lot more leaf canopy. And the leaves of that grapevine are basically doing one thing only. They're making sugar, lots and lots of sugar, which they're transporting down through the vascular system to the grapes. So it stands to reason the more leaves that you have, the bigger and more vigorous that vine is, the more sugar that's going to be pumped down to the grapes. So the end result is when the grapes are ripe, and that's kind of an intrinsic thing within the metabolism of the grape itself, and not, ironically, related that much to what the sugar content is, even though a lot of people pick on the amount of sugar. By the time the grapes are actually really ripe and ready to pick, an irrigated vine is typically going to have much higher sugar content. And the amount of sugar determines how much alcohol is going to be in the wine. The more sugar, the more alcohol. So if you take grapes from an irrigated vine, I can almost guarantee you that in the same situation relative to a non-irrigated vine next door, you're going to end up with a wine that has more alcohol. Part of the thing that started happening in California, and it totally corresponds with irrigation, is that the alcohol started getting higher and higher. And now you routinely have wines from California, and starting in Oregon now, because we have irrigated vines here, that are 14 and 15% alcohol. Back at the end of Prohibition, one of the things that they put in for taxes was that table wine, definition of table wine was anything that was below 14% alcohol. Once you were above 14% alcohol, you had to pay 4 times as much tax because it was considered a dessert wine. And so in essence, by the old criteria, what we're making to a large extent are a lot of dessert wines for people, and people aren't drinking these with dessert, they're trying to drink them with meals. So what you will find with dry farm, non-irrigated vineyards is that they will tend to have alcohols that are 12, 12.5%, maybe 13% in a warm vintage, where an irrigated vineyard will be much, much higher. So coming back to that thing about vintages and having wines that reflect the vintage at hand, a dry farm vineyard is going to reflect that much more effectively than an irrigated vineyard is, because almost all vintages, those irrigated vines are going to have really high alcohols, where the dry farm's going to go up and down a bit depending on what the weather was like and just how much sugar was being pumped down into the grapes. So it all kind of comes back together.
Yeah, yeah. I got to say, it's fascinating how many different subjects you've just covered in your explanation of all of this, and I think that speaks to really the excitement of working in the industry you work in. Is that you touched on a lot of science, you touched on taxes and so governmental oversight issues. You touched on things related to. I had no idea that irrigation had any influence on alcohol. I know that I have preferences for alcohol, under a certain level, but I had no idea that there was an influence related to irrigation there. So there, and then you also talked about sustainability as well. So there's lots and lots of things that come into play in your decision making every day, and we haven't even talked about the decisions that you make related to what you're planting, where you're planting it, the positioning of the plants, what you're doing with the leaves on the plants and the training of the vines and all of that. So there's so much for you to consider, and each one of those considerations have some impact on what ends up on that table between that husband and that wife at that restaurant, right?
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that keeps making this business so fascinating for me is that I am having to make these decisions all the time, and my vineyard is kind of one massive experiment, which I think I told you earlier, dealing with these various things. And I have to say, it's kind of interesting. My wife has a doctorate in pharmacology, and she was a researcher at the medical school here in Portland. And there used to be this joke when we were on a vacation that, like, the Sunday or Saturday before we would come home from vacation, she was kind of going, oh, I have to go back to work. And our kids would be going, oh, I have to go back to school. And I'd be going, God, I wonder what's going on with the vines or how the wine's doing in the cellar. I can't wait to get back. Yeah. And it used to drive her really crazy. So at one point, and it was right when our second youngest child graduated from college, and all of her income was going to pay for his school. He went to Rhode Island School of Design, which was not inexpensive. And I said, well,
right?
At RISD, yeah. And I said, if you want to be part of the winery and work out there, you should quit now, because we won't notice that income loss, because we haven't seen it for years anyway. Because our daughter before him went to Vassar. That was also expensive. And so she did. And so in 2010, she started working at the winery. And it took a while for me to adjust of having this partner in the deal. And there were some times she had to sit me down and go, look, you have to give me some piece of this to do. But she loves working in the vineyard and being part of decisions. And she recently got hold of the culture collection at UC Davis to get some Ribolla Gialla and Picolite to go into a Friulian blend that I've been working on for a long time, but she knew that those two grape varieties were kind of missing from the overall blend. So she's part of it now, and it's fun. We have a good time kind of discussing it. Plus, I have to say, she has gotten in amazing shape. You cannot believe how walking up and down vineyard rows every day, up and down this hillside, gets you in phenomenal shape. And it's fun for me to just see this happening in her, and it's a bit of reflection of probably what's been going on.
So we've now covered wellness and fitness too. So
yeah.
See how many things, how many points we touch on.
So I guess I should be like a cheerleader for getting into the vineyard and wine business.
Well, you have you mentioned the word disciples a while ago, and you were really talking about your customers. You now talked about your wife working with you, but you've had other people, and you continue to have other people work alongside you, perhaps as an assistant winemaker or some other capacity. And several of them have gone on to start their own wine labels and be quite successful themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of relationship that you've had with some of these folks, and perhaps what you feel when somebody leaves you and goes on to create their own thing?
Yeah, you know what, I've always become friends with the people that are working for me, and there was a time when I was closer in age to the guys that were working for me. Now they're much younger than me, and I kind of almost look at them more as kind of like graduate students or something now. And so, and I realize that for the most part they will at some point decide they want to go off and do their own thing. So I have them on borrowed time. If I can get 3 or 4 years out of somebody, even 5, I feel like I'm pretty lucky, because people that I hire they're all bright. They all have a lot to add to what I do. Everybody that has worked for me has had an impact on what I'm doing. And I could go through each and every person and say, well, he influenced me to do this and that. So I've got Jay Summers, who has J. Christopher Winery, who's making really world-class Pinot Noir and is in a partnership with Ernie Lucen from Germany. Tyson Crowley, who has Crowley Wines now and is making really great wine also. And in fact, he and I are, I think, going to do some tastings together down in San Francisco, and then maybe later back in New York, and that's kind of fun. Cool. And Scott Frank with Bow and Arrow Wines, who's got a lot of really interesting ideas and things that are kind of out of the mainstream that, of course, I think is really great. Doing stuff. And then I've got my present guy, Tom Savilli, who's just really, really sharp as can be, and and he's worked for me for a few years now, so I'm kind of like, I wonder how long I can keep him. It's just, but yeah, it's been, and it's hard when I lose people, because then I have to find somebody else and kind of convince them of the craziness of my ways, and
right,
and then move on.
But how do you identify? I mean, you have a great track record. You just talked about several people who have gone on to develop some fairly well-regarded labels. And so what is it that these guys had in common that you found before they even started working with you? That's I guess, maybe it's a mystery. Who knows?
Great sense of humor. Super sharp. I think enthusiastic, good, obviously interest in the whole topic that's going on. So, all of the above, and oftentimes I meet them in the marketplace, or somebody that I know will, say, hey, because they know maybe somebody's moving on, and they go, hey, I know somebody who's really good, and you should talk to this guy. And so word of mouth type of thing.
Working with you has to be coveted among that set of people who really recognize who share your worldview. Let's use that term.
Yes.
So we have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit more in detail about the Deep Roots Coalition that you formed, and maybe what some of the other folks that are involved with that are doing. And also I wanted to touch a little bit more on the fact that beyond the Burgundy varieties, there are other things, and Jay is a big fan of Austrian winemaking and winemaking styles, and you mentioned has a partnership with a German winemaker. Scott is a big fan of the Loire Valley and other things like that. So there's other things that are going on in Oregon, and you are experimenting with things as well. You talked about various northern Italian things, and one of the projects that I saw you had been working on, or may be working on now, relates to white wines that have extended exposure to the skins. So, I've not asked any question, but I brought up a lot of topics, and I'll let you. Maybe I'll just say go, and you can go in whatever direction you want.
That's fair. Actually, one of the latest things that you just touched on briefly, my wife and I took a trip over to Europe just before harvest, 1st of September, and we went down to Austria and went hiking there. But I really wanted to go down to the Collio, on the border of Italy and Slovenia. Mm-hmm. And there was one guy in particular I wanted to talk to, and I met him. Actually, he was here with Jewel Dresner, mm-hmm. and it was Sasha Radikon. Yep. And I love this guy's wine, and he's one of these guys that's definitely out of the mainstream, but people that know Radikon is, and I know you know Radikon.
Yeah, sure.
He makes amazing wines, and one of the things that he makes, and I've been experimenting with this for several years now, is a thing called Ramato, and Ramato is Italian for coppery or copper colored, and it's a traditional old way of making Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, as it's called in Italian, and that grape has some color in the skin. It's a mutant of Pinot Noir, and so it's retained some of the color, but not a lot. It's typically made into a white wine, but the traditional way that it used to be made was in leaving it on the skins for various periods of time, whether you do it before, at beginning of the fermentation, like crush the grapes, leave it on the skins for a period of time, extract some color, and then press it and make it kind of like you would make a white wine, but you end up with a pink wine, or whether, even going further back in the way Sasha Radikon makes it, whether you ferment on the skins like you would do a red wine, even though this is clearly called a red grape. Yeah. Clearly called a white grape. In fact, my son, in doing one of my labels, put pink wine on it, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has to pass on all your labels, and they would not approve the label because they said we had to put white wine on it because Pinot Gris is clearly a white wine. And my son was railing about, they don't understand, this is pink wine. And I said, you just can't take them straight on. You just put wine on it and it'll be fine. And so that was what he got approved. But so Pinot Gris, normally a white wine. The traditional way, though, is to make this lightly colored pink wine. So after I went and visited Sasha Radikon, because I wanted to learn how he made this wine. It's not obvious because you don't want to get it really bitter, and if you have too much skin or unripe grapes with a lot of seed contact during the fermentation, then you get bitterness in the wine, and that's not really very attractive. So I went to talk to him because he had mentioned about the skins and this flavor in the skins, and that you can taste the bitterness when they're slightly underripe, but when they reach a certain point of ripeness, that bitterness goes away, and the color of the seeds inside, what those should look like. And I happened to get there in early September, as I hoped I would, but this was luck, and luck defines a lot of my life. I got there the day before he was going to pick the Pinot Gris, and he was stalled because it was raining. But his father was such a sweetheart, went out into the vineyard and picked a bunch of Pinot Gris clusters and brought them in, and we sat around his kitchen table, and he showed me what the taste of a ripe Pinot Gris tasted like, biting into it. Take a slightly underripe one and a ripe one. You could never get this in a textbook. It was something that you could only have gotten in this kind of one-on-one situation, and I walked away from that.
Sensory education, and you do this every year, I'm sure, as you go out and taste fruit and make decisions based on a taste. So how could you get out of a textbook?
Exactly, and so I was really excited. I came, and in the meantime, we'd had my crew dropping some of the Pinot Gris crop, because that was another thing, is that you had to have a smaller crop out there. And I came back and I started tasting, and first time I walked out in the vineyard after I got back, the skins were really bitter, so I knew, okay, I got to hang on. I can't do this right now. And I waited, and sure enough, at some point, that tannin started going down, the seeds turned brown, and I said, okay, let's pick it. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the downsides of this is that the fruit is very, very ripe, and so you have a lot of sugar in the fruit. So the alcohol is going to be relatively high on it, but that's the way Radikon's wines are too. That's part of the nuance of this kind of wine. But I dealt with it just the way I would deal with a red wine. I destemmed it, put it in a fermenter, punched it down, all during the fermentation, pressed it off, and it looks like a light red wine, but it's got this bit of a texture like a red wine, a little bit of tannin in it, but not a lot, and it's going to be really cool. And I made 3 barrels out of it, so which will make about 75 cases, which is not very much wine.
Not at all.
But I realized this wine is for wine geeks.
Yeah.
That's just what this is going to be about, and they're going to be guys like you who want to try this wine, and it's pretty. And the other thing is, unlike most white wines, I've got to age this in barrel for pretty much 2 years. I've got to age it the way I age red wines.
Huh, okay.
So it's a leap in terms of but to me, I'm probably more excited about that particular. I mean, it's 3 barrels out of probably 120 that I have in the cellar. But if you came to Cameron, the first thing I'd go is, hey, let me show you this I'm calling it Radiconish wine that I got back here.
Is that going to be the label, or is that just what you?
I'm not sure. I'd have to pass that by Sasha, I think,
right,
before I did that. But I would love to do something like that. Yeah.
And to be clear, he's not the only winemaker. His father was making these wines before, or
exactly.
Father or uncle? Father. Stanko.
Yes.
Right. And but there are other winemakers who continue this tradition, which is an ancient tradition, and using various different container types like amphora. Sometimes doing it in steel, and sometimes doing it in barrel. So there's variations on this theme, and it's what some refer to as orange wine or brown wine sometimes, and it's fascinating to see so many producers in the New World experimenting with or embracing this approach. So I'm very excited to see what comes out of your cellar with these.
Oh, and I should add the antecedent to this wine I started about 3 years ago, and that was taking in Pinot Gris. And I didn't have the courage to do the Sasha Radicon thing, but taking in Pinot Gris and crushing it and letting it sit on the skins for about 4 or 5 hours and treading it, getting inside and walking around in it, which a lot of people would think was pretty romantic. It actually was pretty cold is what it was. But treading it and then pressing it, and I would get a certain amount of color in it. So I would get this light, coppery colored wine, which I then called Ramato, and my son with his RISD degree has been making these gorgeous labels, and he made a gorgeous label for that wine. And I came out with it, and and it's kind of a pink wine, and when I took it out and started letting people taste it, I had more than one person taste it and go, well, if this is what Pinot Gris could be, I would actually like Pinot Gris. So that I thought was that was a big plus for me, was that by returning at least partway to this traditional way of making Pinot Gris, that people kind of went, whoa, this is really good. Yeah. So I urge people who can get their hand on a bottle of Ramato, Cameron Ramato, to just try it. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised, especially if you like pink wine. It's pretty neat stuff.
Cool. All right. Well, now you also added art to the conversation with the work that your son is doing, and it's something that I think we see a lot in the wine world as well. So, lots and lots of topics here. I appreciate the chance to just begin to understand the world of Cameron and the world of John Paul. What I would love in closing, we've heard a lot of new things for our audience here in terms of philosophy in winemaking, in terms of decisions that one makes in the entire production process, and ultimately in the resulting wine. For somebody who has sort of been introduced to all of these new concepts today and wants to just begin to explore the type of stuff that you have been working on and that you are so passionate about, maybe they're not in a market where Cameron wines can easily be found. What would you recommend for consumers out there to continue their exploration of the type of things that we've just been talking about?
Well, okay, I have a website, CameronWines.com. I don't sell wine on my website, which kind of is like, really, but I don't. I sell it. I sell all the wine to retail outlets in Portland where people can go to links on my website in order to get the wine, and then they can find these wine retail shops and see who has it. But what the website does is dispenses information, and so my wife is pretty good at getting me about once every. I'm going to say once a month, but it's probably not really once a month. It's about once every 6 weeks or so, I will write some new thing on there. And it could be, it's, you know what, it ranges just like this conversation we've had today, from over a lot of different topics. And they're all on there. They're all archived on there. And so you can look for different topics and you can go. I mean, the latest one I think was on Nebbiolo, because that's one of my big loves. We didn't even get to Nebbiolo in this.
That'll be our next conversation.
But if they go to the website, they'll be able to access a lot of information and maybe some humor as well.
Oh, I can assure people that they will find a great deal of humor in in what you deliver. We'll have to look at some of the posters that you've created and other things, because there's a lot of humor in what you do.
That's what keeps me going, is humor. Yeah. I am married to the funniest person on this planet. Actually, maybe our son is the funniest person, but he got his sense of humor from her, and well, I guess from both of us, but and it keeps me going. It's important. Humor is really important.
Well, that's great. So the website, the address is
CameronWines.com.
Okay, great, and we'll have a link.
It's one of those things. If you Google Cameron Winery, you'll get a link to the website there. So
yeah, indeed. We'll have a link under this video wherever it appears as well, and so people can find more about you, and also find retailers who carry your wines, and hopefully, if they can get them shipped to whatever state they're in, they'll be able to do that as well, assuming they're still in stock. So. Oh, great. Hey, John, thank you so much for making some time for us and our conversation, and I know that I learned a lot today, and I'm sure that our audience did too. So, any last words of advice or anything that you want to share with our audience before we part?
I think they've probably heard enough from me by now.
All right. Well, hey. Thank you so very much, and I look forward to reconnecting again so that we can talk about Nebbiolo. That will be a lot of fun.
All right, great.
All right, take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.